What is evolution? Evolution is the theory that the differences between modern plants and animals are because of the changes that happened by a natural process over a very long time. Evidence of evolution include fossils, biogeography, DNA and proteins, and anatomy structures. Fossil evidence. The fossil record provides snapshots of the past that, when assembled, illustrate a panorama of evolutionary change over the past 4 billion years. The picture may be smudged in places and may have bits missing, but fossil evidence clearly shows that life is old and has changed over time. This chart shows the camel's evolution that scientists have put together using fossils. 65 million years ago, all the way to the left, shows that the camel used to be very tiny and didn't have a hump at all. As you look further to the right of the chart, you see the bones of the skull and teeth, as well as limb bones, growing larger, and by 23 million years ago, you begin to notice the camel's famed hump. These are the fossils of the ichthyosaur, which was discovered in Germany. Highly streamlined with a fish-like tail and limbs modified into paddles, ichthyosaurs represent the adaptation of the reptiles into an aquatic way of life. They lived throughout the Mesozoic and became extinct before the end of the Cretaceous. In 1915, the German geologist Alfred Wegener was struck by the fact that identical fossil plants and animals had been discovered on the opposite sides of the Atlantic. Since the ocean was too far for them to have traversed on their own, Wegener proposed that the continents had once been connected. In the 1960s, scientists carefully mapped the ocean floor, making it possible to demonstrate plate tectonics, which is the mechanism behind continental drift. The idea behind plate tectonics and how the same species will appear on completely different continents is called biogeography. Biogeographers now recognize that as continents collide, their species can mingle, and when the continents separate, they take the new species with them. Africa, South America, Australia, and New Zealand, for example, were all once joined into one supercontinent called Gondwanaland. The continents split off one by one, first Africa, then New Zealand, then finally Australia and South America, taking the species with them. The DNA in our genes preserves a record of evolution, offering evidence that species have changed and that they share a common ancestry. An example of using DNA to show this would be the giant panda versus red panda case. Scientists used to think the giant panda and the red panda were closely related, as shown by this tree. It indicates that the hypothesis was that giant pandas and red pandas share a common ancestor and that they are both closely related to raccoons. The last picture shows that the truth found through DNA comparison. Giant pandas are more closely related to bears than they are to the red panda, and the red panda is more closely related to the raccoon rather than the giant panda. Homologous is defined as characteristics that exist similarly in two different species because they evolved from a common ancestor that also had those characteristics. This pertains to evidence of evolution because it shows how some species are related and why. Homologous structures are the result of divergence, where a trait held by a common ancestor evolves into different variations over time. One example of homologous is how the mammal's middle ear was derived from the reptile's jaw. As the mammals grew, the small bones got progressively smaller in size and eventually detached from the jaw. Another example is how all of these animals, the frog, rabbit, lizard, and bird, all have three of the same bones, the humerus, ulna, and radius. This shows that all of these animals share these bone characteristics because they came from a common ancestor, the Eusethopterion, which was a fish. Analogous can be defined as species with similar-looking characteristics because of similar selection pressures, but have different evolutionary beginnings. Analogous structures are the result of convergent evolution, which is the process in which species that are not closely related to each other independently evolve similar kinds of traits. An example of analogous is bat versus bird wings. You may think that since both animals fly, that they got that characteristic from a common ancestor, but that turns out to be false. Even though they share a common ancestor and both inherit 4 limbs because of it, they individually, as two different species, evolved wings due to selection pressures, variation, mutation, and finally natural selection. Another example of analogous is shark fins versus dolphin fins. Both the shark and the dolphin have a common ancestor, but that characteristic of having fins evolved independently due to selection pressures and mutations. A vestigial structure is a feature that was an adaptation for the organism's ancestor, but that evolved to be non-functional because the organism's environment changed. Fish species that live in completely dark caves have vestigial non-functional eyes. When their sighted ancestors ended up living in caves, there was no longer any natural selection that maintained the function of the fish's eyes. So, fish with better sight no longer outcompeted fish with the worst sight. Today, these fish still have eyes, but they are not functional and they are not an adaptation. They are just the byproducts of the fish's evolutionary history. Another example of vestigial is the pelvic bones in the baleen whale. So, let's wrap this up. What's evolution? Evolution is the theory that the differences between modern plants and animals are because of changes that happen by a natural process over a very long time. Evidence of evolution include fossils, biogeography, DNA and proteins, and anatomy structures. Scientists are specialized into these categories and more, still finding new evidence for the support of evolution.